This year, this decade has gotten off to a rocky start, to say the least. I intended to make this video regardless, but since the present is less than ideal, right now is an excellent time to look back at the last 10 years in games, to celebrate and remember the amazing experiences that this medium has brought us. I've somehow identified my top 10 favorites among the many games I played between 2010 and 2019. The games you're seeing clips of now didn't make the cut, but they're also incredible, memorable games that broadened my horizons, showed me something beautiful, or otherwise stand out as uniquely excellent. Before I get to the top 10, there are a few honorable mentions I want to highlight. Some of these games might not have received as much attention as I think they deserve, and others just barely missed being on my top 10. I almost didn't play Prey, and judging by the online conversation and lack of buzz, a lot of people skipped it. And that's a real shame, because while Prey isn't super flashy or wholly original, it is the best immersive sim I've played during the genre's revival period. It's better than Eidos Montreal's Deus Ex revivals, and Arcane Studios' own Dishonored games. If you like immersive sims, you need to play Prey. It's smart, measured science fiction with challenging moral and ethical quandaries, complemented by tight game design with a wonderfully realized world to explore. Dear Esther is a divisive game that gave rise to the so-called walking simulator genre, games with minimal gameplay that are more interactive experiences than winnable games. Dear Esther is superior to most of the other games bearing that label because it's such a focused experience. It's relatively brief, and unlike many of the other examples of the genre, it's more interested in creating mood than mystery. The lonely Hebridean island setting, haunting music, and poetic prose give me a profound sense of melancholy, far above and beyond what I'd expect possible given that there's no concrete story. It's the same kind of subjective wonder you can get from a work of traditional fine art. Some are arrested by the beauty, while others only spare a glance. I can't argue with those who call this game pretentious. It's easy to see why people feel that way. Dear Esther is certainly not for everybody, but it is for me. I can't deny its power and emotional resonance each and every time I've walked through it. The Stanley Parable is a sign of video games coming into their own as an art form. It's a rumination on the nature of interactive media and the relationship between creator and player, wrapped in the sugarcoating of comedy and told as an interactive experience. It's funny, it's insightful, and it's genuinely clever, yet so simple. Some of its insights feel a bit dated now because the industry has kept on progressing. Trends have changed, and what was once perceptive is now obvious. That's not the fault of this game, it just makes it a bit of a time capsule. But its special brand of existential madness is still well worth experiencing today. Factorio is amazing. Like a lot of games from the past decade, its fundamentals are resource gathering and crafting. But Factorio is about automation, making that grind of mining and crafting into a puzzle. How can you piece together all of these components into a system that will produce more than you ever could on your own, faster and more efficiently than you thought possible? It's intoxicating and kind of overwhelming. It's a game that I'll never fully be able to explore the possibilities of, but I've seriously enjoyed my time with Factorio. I've particularly enjoyed playing with friends. Factorio is an essential game for anyone who likes engineering, systems design, and open-ended problem solving. I'm sort of grouping the next three games together, not because they don't each deserve individual praise, but because they represent an awesome trend. Indie developers picking up the neglected mantles of old classic series. In this case, it's SimCity, Harvest Moon, and Roller Coaster Tycoon, which were respectively the inspirations for Cities Skylines, Stardew Valley, and Parkitect. I grew up playing those original series. They're some of my favorite games ever, but each has fallen into neglect, either failing to evolve meaningfully or else evolving detrimentally. I have a whole video about Cities Skylines that's a bit out of date now considering how many updates, mods, and official expansions have come out since. It was an excellent city builder at launch, and it's even better now, even if you don't pay for any of the DLC. Colossal Order has generously rolled out significant new feature updates for free along with each paid DLC. They've been killing it, and it's kept me returning to the game on pretty much an annual basis since release. Cities Skylines is easily the best city building game yet made. Stardew Valley is a game that really could, and maybe should be on my top 10 list. It's that good. It advances the basic template that's been well worn by the Harvest Moon and Rune Factory franchises, with a lot of smart quality of life improvements, and a very welcome crafting system that enhances rather than steals the focus from the main activities of farming, foraging, fishing, and forging friendships. Although it's clearly stolen so much inspiration from it, I no longer think of Stardew Valley as the indie Harvest Moon. It's escaped that shadow and stands on its own as a great game. Parkitect is the best emulation of the classic Roller Coaster Tycoon experience that I've found. The original game was a fine balance between management sim and actual park construction. A lot of games that have tried to recapture RCT's essence have tilted too heavily towards the minutiae of building and theming. You can certainly do a lot of customization in Parkitect, but if you want to simply focus on meeting the scenario goals, you can do that too, and you don't need to get bogged down with decorating everything. Outer Wilds explores science fiction concepts perhaps better than any other game I've seen. Most sci-fi games use the genre as an excuse to have spaceships, aliens, and laser guns, or maybe some sort of dystopian social commentary. Outer Wilds instead tackles big philosophical, existential questions about life, its origin, purpose, and the meaning we each bring to it. The game is about learning and exploration. You don't get upgrades, you don't permanently unlock things, you don't level up. The only thing that gets better, stronger, is your knowledge of the game's universe and the mysteries it contains. And the best part of all is the mysteries and their answers turn out to be intellectually and emotionally satisfying. The Walking Dead is the unlikely story of how one developer revived and reinvented a dormant game genre while also breathing new life into a tired storytelling premise, and found such sudden and widespread success that it set the company on course for its eventual collapse. In 2012, the adventure game was all but dead. Telltale Games was one of the few developers trying to make adventure games live and breathe again, with only limited success. The Walking Dead took the genre in a different direction by emphasizing player choice in the narrative. At first, that was accompanied by some light puzzle solving, but those elements got stripped away over the course of its 5 episodes. What replaced it was a greater sense of connection with the characters and scenarios presented. Early adventure game puzzles were about challenging the player on an intellectual level. This new approach with The Walking Dead challenges players on an emotional one. Other games, most prominently the Mass Effect trilogy, had popularized the idea of games driven by player choice. Your choices matter, these developers would say, but such claims were always kind of suspect. How much real difference were you making in the grand scheme? The Walking Dead hits you up front with the idea that the story is up to you. Each episode leads off with the bold statement, "This game series adapts to the choices you make. The story is tailored by how you play." This is true, but I think a portion of the audience misunderstood the meaning here. Tailored is a great way to describe it. When you get a piece of clothing tailored, you're not fundamentally changing the garment. It's getting minor alterations so that it fits better. That's The Walking Dead. Your choices matter, but they won't fundamentally alter the structure of the story being told. The first time through, you don't know the story. You don't know which are the pivotal decisions with long-lasting consequences and which are minor. You don't know which parts of the story are changeable and which are fixed. You don't know what will lead to a game over, and what will be a bad outcome you just have to live with. The first time I played, I was terrified of Clementine dying. I thought if I didn't mash those buttons fast enough, or if I made a bad decision, this poor little girl would be dead, and it would be my fault. I think that's exactly what was intended. Some players were disappointed that the ending is essentially the same no matter what choices you make. I think that view is largely missing the point. The Walking Dead does actual role-playing far better than many games that are branded as RPGs. It is literally asking you to take on the role of Lee Everett, asking what you'd say and what you'd do within certain parameters that define the extent of his character. Those questions aren't just about changing the final outcome. It's an exercise in emotional, moral, and ethical decision-making. The quandaries are there to get the player to engage with the story. In the social game Would You Rather, it's not about actually going through with the radical scenarios presented. It's about making the difficult choice and seeing what that says about you as a person and what it says about your friend who made a different choice. That's The Walking Dead, a series of terrible choices that have no ideal outcome. That's why at the conclusion of each episode, they show you the most pivotal choices you made and how they align with those of other players. The Walking Dead is the most gut-wrenching game I've ever experienced. Not because of the gore or violence, it was because the violent, gory, dangerous world was threatening characters I had real investment in. The game invited me to take part in their story in a way that a more passive medium like TV or graphic novels can't. It was a symbiotic relationship between player and writer. The graphic novel-inspired visuals are surprisingly effective at conveying real human emotion. In some ways, the stylized nature of the game makes the grounded and serious narrative all the more palpable. There are a few rough edges here. The technology sometimes lets down the intent of scenes. They can be a bit awkward and stilted, despite mostly excellent performances. Some of the writing doesn't work as well, depending on the choices you've made, and the drama occasionally feels forced. But the totality of the work is undeniably effective despite these blemishes. The Walking Dead is a game that caught me totally by surprise. I didn't expect to love it. I didn't expect to be emotionally devastated by it, but I was. And it was such a profound experience that I had to share it with others. I wound up playing through this game with friends and family again and again because I wanted to see what choices they'd make. I wanted them to have this special experience that I'd had. I can't think of another game that made me do that. Numbers 9 and 10 on my list share a lot of similar elements. They demonstrate how differently games can handle similar themes and ideas. The Walking Dead invited players to be active participants in shaping the narrative. The Last of Us keeps the traditional wall between story and gameplay, but what it lacks in narrative interactivity, it makes up for in the quality of its presentation. The Last of Us is yet another post-apocalypse zombie game. What makes this one stand out is how the whole package came together. The writing, acting, music, and environment design. Strictly speaking, The Walking Dead is probably a better video game in the sense that it leverages what makes games a unique storytelling medium. But in terms of polished execution and singular vision, The Last of Us is the superior post-apocalyptic zombie game about a surrogate father-daughter team. One is a malleable player choice-driven adventure, the other is a meticulously crafted experience. Since at least the late 90s, a segment of blockbuster video games had been chasing this notion of cinematic, movie-like storytelling, emphasizing voiced, directed, non-interactive cutscenes, basically movie clips inserted between gameplay. The Last of Us is the first time I felt like a game actually lived up to those cinematic aspirations. I used to think that The Last of Us would make an excellent movie, and now it seems like an adaptation might finally happen in the form of a miniseries. But whatever happens there, I've realized I'm so attached to the particular staging, pacing, direction, and especially performances in this game that a live-action version just wouldn't be the same. I love the specific way that scenes play out. The writing, the delivery, the beats, and especially the silence. I love how quiet this game dares to get. There's something so confident about the way The Last of Us avoids doing things just to keep the player's attention. It trusts that the audience doesn't need constant over-the-top action to be engaged. The performances and the technology that brings them to life are good enough to make the simple human drama of a couple people talking to one another compelling. In fact, I think it's these quiet moments that are the game's strongest.
I'm not her, you know.
What?
Maria told me about Sarah.
Ellie?
And
You are treading on some mighty thin ice here.
I'm sorry about your daughter, Joel, but I have lost people too.
You have no idea what loss is.
I've heard it asserted that The Last of Us is the best realization of a flawed ideal for a game. It was the pinnacle of games' pursuit of cinematic quality when it came out. Many games have since surpassed it in visual fidelity. There are other big-budget, high-quality games with serious adult drama at their core. but I don't think any of them have topped The Last of Us in terms of focus and tonal consistency. The Last of Us knows what it wants to say and spends very little time veering from that path. The rough and tumble gameplay complements the story and the world. It feels weighty, every shot lands with impact, every punch is brutal. You're in the trenches with these characters. You're meant to feel their struggle for survival, not to have a personal power fantasy. But the gameplay is not why The Last of Us is remembered. It's Ellie and Joel. It's their tragic, violent, beautiful story. It's that incredible, pitch-perfect ending. Both Telltale's Walking Dead and The Last of Us eschew the video game temptation to make the stakes epic and world-changing. They are personal epics. They're not about saving the world. They're about saving one person who is your world. Now for something completely different. I've been playing Mario Kart since I was a kid. I never expected anything to top the nostalgic love I had for Mario Kart 64, my introduction to the series. That game hasn't aged well in a lot of ways, but you always remember your first. Shedding the rose-colored glasses, I'd argue that Mario Kart 8, specifically the Nintendo Switch re-release, is the best game in the series. The arcade kart racing chaos that's always been at the heart of these games is better than ever. There's a fine mix of skill and chance that keeps things interesting for a long, long time. I originally got the game when it was released for the ill-fated Wii U. It was a great game then, but with one extremely disappointing element, the undercooked battle mode, which repurposed racetracks as battle arenas. It didn't work. It was the one glaring oversight in an otherwise well-tuned, highly polished game. Then the Switch launched, and we got Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, which included all the DLC tracks and a completely revamped battle mode with additional game types, options, better performance, and most importantly, proper battle arenas. Still, racing is the main attraction in Mario Kart 8. Most of its 48 tracks are good to great, with only a handful of boring ones. But even when you're on one of those less inspired courses, the game around it is still solid and consistently engaging. These tracks are livelier than ever before. In addition to elaborate obstacles, some courses feature branching paths. Others are littered with boost pads, jumps, zero-gravity sections that turn you upside down, and a few courses are point-to-point races instead of traditional loops. The variety extends to the visual design as well. It's not just Mario-themed courses anymore. Several other Nintendo franchises, old and new, serve as inspiration. No track feels like a copy of another. It's also one of the best-looking games Nintendo has yet released. Mario Kart just looks fun. When I see footage of it, it makes me want to be playing instead of watching. Before Super Smash Bros., Mario Kart was the Nintendo standard in local multiplayer games. That's continued to be the case for me. I still love playing games in the same space as the people I'm playing with. Online is just no substitute. And Mario Kart 8 is by far the game I've done that with the most this past decade. It's one of the few games my wife and I play together and both really enjoy. I think what makes a good party game is a mix of skill, luck, and social interaction. Mario Kart has always been and continues to be an excellent party game, keeping the time-honored tradition of couch multiplayer alive. I would never have guessed I'd play more Mario Kart as an adult than I did as a kid, but here we are with the best Mario Kart game yet. They're gonna have a hard time topping this one. I'm combining the 2016 Hitman reboot with its 2018 sequel on my list because they're such similar games that the levels for the first game were released as DLC for the second. Hitman 2 is really the perfect Hitman experience because of this, but it was Hitman 2016 that freshly revived the series. They're both great, and they're both worth celebrating. This franchise emphasizes the sneaking around and hiding in plain sight aspects of spy fiction, instead of the action-heavy moments more frequently portrayed by video games. That's probably why the series isn't as popular as it should be, and that's a shame. A lot of people are missing out on the great fun here. The Hitman series has always been unique. It has not always been good, accessible, and streamlined. In 2016, that changed, with the soft reboot simply titled Hitman. After a wrong-headed venture into more linear territory with Hitman Absolution, IO Interactive refocused their series back to basics, and in my view, perfected the core Hitman experience. Hitman throws players into small interconnected open worlds, what we used to call sandboxes, with a couple of objectives and a few nudges toward possible solutions. From there, it's up to you. Use stealth and subterfuge to get close to your targets, or find a way to make it look like an accident. Eavesdrop on passers-by to get intel on the situation and leads on how to proceed, or go in guns blazing if you have the skill and you want to play the game wrong. Hitman allows players to experience the thrills and joys of sneaking around where you're not supposed to be, plotting to do things you're not supposed to do, and just generally making mischief, all in the safe and legal context of sitting in front of a video game. It's the other half of the spy fantasy that James Bond games generally don't spend much time on. You've got a diverse array of beautifully realized locations, useful spy gadgets, and tons of creative and outlandish ways to kill targets. In real life, contract killing is some dark subject matter. Hitman pretends to take itself seriously on the surface, but it's got a wonderfully absurd and often silly sense of humor that reveals itself as you play. It knows the premise of a genetically engineered bald guy with an easily identifiable barcode tattooed on the back of his head being the world's greatest assassin is pretty dumb. The game lets players know it's okay to laugh. It's never afraid of being just a game. The Hitman reboot did two crucial things different from its predecessors to make for the best games yet. First, they streamlined the controls and user interface. There are a lot of things you can interact with and do in Hitman. Previous games relied on control schemes that were just a bit too clumsy, and while there's still a fair amount of complexity, it's much more manageable and results in a lot fewer frustrating moments where you screw up a carefully orchestrated plan with the wrong button press. Although sometimes screwing up and having to deal with the ensuing chaos is part of the fun. Second, new Hitman incentivizes you to dig deeper into the game by replaying levels and trying different approaches. Past games offered a variety of ways to kill targets, but Hitman 2016 introduced an achievement system which awards players for exploring the possibility space with new gadgets, weapons, and cosmetic unlocks that further provide new solutions to problems. There's nothing else like Hitman. While the wildly popular Assassin's Creed series garnered initial interest for allowing players to step into the shoes of an assassin, the games quickly veered away from that focus. Hitman and Hitman 2 found success by returning to the series' roots and centering squarely on assassination. I hope it continues to do that for years to come. Doom is the franchise that defined one of the most popular genres in gaming, but by 2016, it had fallen on hard times. There hadn't been a Doom game in 12 years. The id Software of old, the one that made Wolfenstein 3D, Classic Doom, and Quake, that company was gone, it seemed. Doom 3 and Rage were much tamer, less exciting games that failed to make as much of a splash in the shooter world. When rumors circulated that Doom 4 was shaping up to be Call of Duty with demons, that seemed sadly pretty likely. Id was no longer a trend-setting leader, it was a follower. Id themselves must have realized this because Doom 4 was scrapped, and from its ashes, a new Doom was born. One that would live up to the legacy of old Doom and Quake, and make new fans of the series. I'm one of those new fans. Before Doom 2016, I had sampled the series mostly as a history lesson, a curiosity about the roots of one of my favorite game genres. New Doom made me a fan almost instantly with its intoxicating combination of fast, brutal gameplay, dry, self-aware humor, and brilliantly implemented music. From the very beginning of the game, I sensed it might be something special. The opening sequence is exquisite. It establishes the action focus of the game. Within moments of starting, you're already shooting demons, and not long after, you have your first arena fight. It establishes the tongue-in-cheek tone with a sly reference to the campy Doom comic from the 90s, and other hints that this game isn't taking itself too seriously. and the title drop hits us with a blast of Mick Gordon's amazing metal score, which ends in perfect sync with Doomguy cocking his shotgun. It gets the player pumped up for a pulse-pounding, fist-pumping, adrenaline rush of an experience. And the rest of the game somehow astoundingly delivers on that promise. After more than a decade of shooters with 2 weapon limits, regenerating health, and an emphasis on moving from cover to cover, id made a game where standing still means death. New Doom rejected pretenses of realism that got in the way of an action focus, and embraced the pure, primal fury of its combat loop. Everything is trying to kill you all the time, so be faster, more agile, more brutal than the demons. Pushing forward and taking the fight to the enemy is incentivized. Special melee attacks called glory kills give health, while chainsawing enemies results in geysers of ammo. You carry a whole diverse arsenal of weapons by the end of the campaign, and you don't ever have to reload them. Who has time for that when you're killing so many demons? The gameplay is the star of the show, but it's well supported by visuals, audio, and story, and the combination of all of those things is what ultimately elevate this game in memory. I was never a fan of metal music, but it's a perfect companion to this game. Not only does it harken back to classic Doom, metal is a great analogy for how Doom plays. Metal, at first blush, is just a bunch of crazy, stupid noise, but it's a highly technical genre, not a brain-dead one. There's a lot of craft behind that noise. Likewise, Doom is smart underneath the loud, dumb exterior, whether it's the gameplay loop or the clever, self-aware way it leans on Doom's history as the basis for an in-universe mythology. It may have been the product of a tumultuous development cycle, but you'd never know that just by playing it. Doom 2016 is as confident, bold, and fun as the classic shooters that inspired it. I'm still planning on doing a whole video about Arkham City, so I won't cannibalize too much of that here. Batman Arkham Asylum was a revelation, see my long-form video on that game, but it's not necessarily one I love returning to all that much. It has great moments, great atmosphere, and solid design, but I feel restricted when I play it because I know the sequels exist, and they provide a greater sense of freedom and variety. Consensus generally places Arkham City as the best of the Batman games, and I'm not here to argue with consensus this time. Arkham City is a brilliant game, but it's also an incredibly logical expansion of the ideas presented in Asylum. Batman's easy to pick up, tricky to master melee combat is expanded. You face larger and more varied groups of enemies that keep things fresh. Stealth encounters are similarly improved. Arkham City isn't so much an open world as it is a larger hub area, like the Asylum was in the first game. Bigger isn't always better, but in this case, I much prefer it. Arkham Asylum was claustrophobic by design. It made you feel like you were trapped in a confined space with the worst people in Gotham. City still finds a way to contain the action, but its larger scope changes the feel substantially. For the first time in the series, you can soar over an urban landscape, choosing your approach from the air. That feels so wonderfully freeing after having to traverse most of the Asylum on foot. The story in Arkham City, while not perfect, gives actual stakes to the proceeding that the first game lacked. Kevin Conroy and Mark Hamill turn in great performances as Batman and the Joker respectively, in a story that takes them both to extreme places. Although the ending is fairly well known, I won't spoil it here. If you somehow haven't played this game, it's still well worth experiencing now. Both the visuals and the game design have aged very gracefully. New Vegas is the pinnacle of the Fallout series. It combines the best of the original Interplay games with the best of the modern Bethesda titles to create an experience that's immersive and deep. What I love most about the Fallout series is the sense of exploration, not only of landscapes and landmarks, but of lore and story. The Bethesda Fallout games are great at landscapes and landmarks. The original games were superb at lore and story, and especially role-playing, the act of finding your place in the world through the choices you make. The games after New Vegas, Fallout 4 and Fallout 76, have precious little role-playing in them. They're much more interested in combat and loot. Most locations are just another type of dungeon where you fight raiders or mutants or giant bugs. In Fallout 1 through New Vegas, the worlds were alive with imaginative places, weird stories, weird people. New Vegas is a bit less goofy than Fallout 2 and 3. It's more grounded, but still has bizarre elements to keep things unexpected. The world of New Vegas is a slice of Mojave Desert rife with interesting factions vying for resources and primacy amongst the others. Unlike a lot of Bethesda games, the main questline is fairly compelling and does a better job of drawing the player into the world of the game. New Vegas leans into the Western aesthetic that's a natural fit for the post-apocalypse and the Americana flavor of Fallout. There are a lot of different approaches to quest design. I get the impression that Bethesda's is to write little scenarios that they want the player to engage in, and then they figure out how to give some amount of player choice within the story they've crafted. In New Vegas, it feels like Obsidian came up with problems, and then thought of many different approaches the player might want to take towards solving it, and who they might want to side with. It's the difference between choose your own adventure and something more akin to real-world problem solving, with all the political and social consequences that entails. At the end of the day, the choices are almost always more complicated than do I want to play as a good guy or a bad guy. In making the choices gray, Obsidian invites the player deeper into the world they've crafted. Context matters more in complex situations. I can't just discern at a glance which path I'd prefer to take, like in more morally black and white role-playing. This also results in a lot of replay value. Taking different approaches with different character builds and siding with different factions changes the experience in a way that makes a long game actually worth replaying. On the surface, Fallout New Vegas is just Fallout 3 set in the Nevada desert, but because of the many design choices made by Obsidian, backed by quality world building and clever, compelling writing, the overall effect is much different. I love Fallout 3. It's the game that got me into the series to begin with, but New Vegas is the game I return to over and over again. This game hasn't aged super well. Visually, it looks pretty rough, especially the character models. Playing this again made me realize just how much they improved the gunplay in Fallout 4, and that's still a notch below your standard first-person shooter. Add to that the general bugginess and jankiness of this game, and it makes it a hard one to recommend to newcomers nowadays. But if you can get past those issues, there's a shining diamond of a game underneath. New Vegas is a special game, even among the best games of the Fallout series. While capturing footage for this video, I stumbled on new things I'd never seen before. New locations, new quests, new tidbits about the world. New Vegas isn't the biggest world in this type of game. It isn't the best looking or the best playing, but it might be the richest one we've seen yet. Titanfall 2 is possibly the most sublime first-person shooter I've ever played. When Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare hit the scene, the original Modern Warfare, it set a new standard for the genre. That game struck a balance between accessibility and depth. The mechanics just felt right. They were fluid, the action was quick. Success in multiplayer matches came from a combination of skill and strategic knowledge of the map and available tools. Respawn Entertainment, the studio behind the Titanfall series, was founded by some of the people responsible for that seminal game. Rather than making a competing modern military shooter, they took things into science fiction territory with much more success than the Call of Duty series managed. Titanfall builds upon Call of Duty's expertly tuned gunplay with greater speed and mobility, and then for its final trick, it throws giant robots into the mix. That sounds great in theory, but it's even better in execution. Doom 2016 might have the best shooter campaign of the decade, but Titanfall 2 has the best multiplayer, with its own excellent campaign as the gravy on top. Multiplayer matches are more dynamic than your typical online shooter. There are distinct phases which keep the dynamics of battle in constant flux. Players begin on foot, which in Titanfall means running, wall running, double jumping, and sliding. It's a frenetic time trying to outmaneuver, outgun, and outthink other players. That dynamic shifts when players start earning their Titans, large robots that can be piloted manually or brought to the battlefield as AI helpers. This phase is defined by asymmetrical combat scenarios. Pilots on foot face off against Titans. Titans are powerful but less maneuverable, and they're more fragile than their bulky frames suggest. If you're in one, it's a whole different but equally satisfying game. Using your Titan effectively can make a huge difference to the score. You can easily rack up kills while in your mech, but a skilled player can take down or severely damage Titans with hit-and-run tactics on foot. Titan vs. Titan combat is about effective use of your Titan's weapons and abilities. It's a bit more like a class-based shooter with powers, cooldowns, and supers. The final phase of the battle begins after a winning team is declared. The losing team attempts to get to an evac point, while the winning team seeks to prevent that by killing players or destroying the escape ship. This flow keeps matches from feeling like 10 to 20 minutes of the same essential gameplay. It gives each part of the game a chance to shine: the on-foot combat, the asymmetrical Titan versus pilot fights, and the mech versus mech team battles. Most of this was true of the first Titanfall, but Titanfall 2 refined the formula, added new tools, new maps, and a whole lot more variety. It also added single-player content in the form of a campaign. The frenetic, skilled action of the multiplayer translates well into a series of mostly linear missions that function as sort of an extended tutorial, showing off different Titan builds, weapons, and enemy types. The campaign features some incredibly inventive levels. In one, you fight through a factory of prefab space colony housing. In another, you're given a device that allows you to time travel at will between past and present versions of the map. I didn't expect to still be playing Titanfall 2 4 years later. I thought the player base would dry up or get too good for me to keep having fun. But I'm still playing. I keep going back to this game and I keep having a great time with it. I'm somewhat competitive even though I don't play consistently. Even when I'm underperforming, I still have a great time with Titanfall 2. Just being in Titanfall 2, just moving around, is a joy, a delight. It's the best shooter of the decade and easily one of the best ever made. This game has been talked about to death. It's been widely praised. So naturally, there's a corresponding backlash of opinion saying it's overrated. Is Breath of the Wild really that good? This game has flaws, obvious weak elements that other games have done much better. But they don't matter ultimately. Breath of the Wild is above all an exceedingly special game for so many of us that played it because of one thing: wonder. When creating the original Legend of Zelda, Shigeru Miyamoto was inspired by experiences he had as a boy, exploring the countryside around his home. He wanted to give players that sense of adventure. All these years later, Breath of the Wild is a beautiful realization of his intentions. This game genuinely gave me that feeling of exploring the woods as a kid. It's not really about what you find, it's far more about the mindset you have while finding it, being curious, seeing the world with fresh eyes. That's why Breath of the Wild is the best open-world game of the last decade. It understands that it isn't enough to simply make a great big map and fill it with activities. You have to inspire wonder. If you felt that wonder, then it's likely this was also one of your favorite games. If it didn't connect with you, you probably evaluate it as the sum of its pros minus its cons. It's just another open-world game, and maybe not what you wanted from Zelda. Here's the thing, I'm not the biggest Zelda fan. I like Zelda games, I've always admired them, but actually playing them is sometimes a chore. They've always had just enough tedious elements to keep me from fully embracing the series. That outlook probably caused me to enjoy this game even more than most. Zelda games since A Link to the Past have been very directed, with the game usually explicitly telling you where to go and when. The quest was heavily guided. With that usual structure removed, Breath of the Wild was finally able to provide a more authentic sense of adventure. For the first time in a long, long time, exploration was truly its own reward. Exploring this new version of Hyrule felt completely natural. Looking back, I realized just how carefully designed the whole thing is. They really thought about how the player would experience the world, and they built it accordingly. These great views don't just happen. The team behind Breath of the Wild had the unenviable task of reinventing Zelda. There were so many ways that could have gone terribly wrong. Nintendo is usually overly cautious, overly reliant on tradition and heritage. To see how drastically they repurposed, remixed, or outright eliminated Zelda staples was continually impressive. We live in an age of weaponized nostalgia and fan service. There are artists out there trying to consistently recreate their greatest hits, and companies trying to capture audiences with new spins on beloved old franchises. It's so rare that these attempts actually stir your emotions like they did when you experienced them for the first time. Breath of the Wild does. It wasn't just nostalgia for Zelda. The world, the game design itself, inspired childlike wonder and curiosity. I don't use this cliched phrase lightly. Exploring Hyrule and Breath of the Wild made me feel like a kid again in the purest way possible. Minecraft is the decade's most important, most impactful, best-selling, most popular game. When it came to my favorite game of the last 10 years, I didn't expect to agree with popular sentiment, but sometimes popular things are popular for good reason. I actually avoided Minecraft for years. It looked unappealing to me. I took it as a silly fad sure to die off quickly, or be forever relegated to the same niche corner of gaming as Dwarf Fortress and Infiniminer, the games that inspired it. It was a game for a different kind of nerd than me. I love building games, but the idea of mining every individual block and slowly, painstakingly rearranging them into something else sounded like a great way to waste a whole lot of time. It was either something I would find incredibly tedious or dangerously addictive. But one day I broke down and paid the paltry sum Mojang charges for this game, and I found my reaction was closer to the dangerously addictive side of the spectrum. Minecraft isn't for everybody, but it is for a whole lot of people because it can be so many different games. There are people who play this game in ways I find completely foreign, and those players would likewise probably find my way of playing uninteresting. Between the standard survival, creative, and adventure modes are a wide variety of experiences. If you want to play it as sort of an RPG, you can. If you want to play it as an open-ended survival game, you can. If you want a limitless virtual Lego set, Minecraft will keep handing you pieces forever. You can play with friends, you can play with strangers, you can play it anywhere on pretty much any device. If you can dream it, someone has probably already built at least a few versions in Minecraft. Modders and artists have added on to the game with tons of new elements, UI, and toolsets. With shaders and resource packs, you can drastically alter the way the game looks. Minecraft represents a lot of gaming trends from the last decade. Early access, crossplay, long-term post-release support, a dedicated streaming community, and its cultural impact reaches far beyond games. Minecraft is one of the biggest, most impactful games of all time, and one of the best ever created. It's simple, accessible, and yet it provides a virtually limitless possibility space to the player. That possibility space is massively increased with the ability to create alternate game modes, either using command blocks or through the many mods available for the original Java version of the game. Minecraft is my #1 game of the decade, and it's not because of its popularity or impact. It's because I genuinely love this game. If you told me I could only play one video game for the rest of my life, I'd probably pick Minecraft, because it's a game I've kept returning to since I first started playing. It's almost certainly the game I've spent the most time with. For nearly 8 years, I've been working on one world, slowly adding to it, slowly building more and more. At first, I resisted playing the game in creative mode. I thought that might ruin the experience for me, the way that unlimited ammo, health, or money cheats can ruin some other games. If you remove the challenge, then where's the sense of accomplishment for doing anything? But eventually my ambitions outgrew standard survival mode, and I took the plunge. I've never looked back. I've enjoyed survival mode, I've enjoyed struggling to build up defenses and a food supply against monsters and hunger and limited health. But now Minecraft is sort of like my model train set. It's all craft, no mine. The sense of accomplishment and ownership is unparalleled by any other game I've ever played. It's pure creation, and that's something I value immensely. After 8 years on the same save, I still feel like there's so much more I can do. In a medium so married to the shifting standards of technology, Minecraft has a rare, timeless quality to it. It's a game I could see myself playing for the next 10 years, and perhaps beyond.